Hello, students. This is Dr. Lyons, and here we are at the last chapter. So this is the last video lecture of the semester. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about other types of human impacts on the ocean. So in the previous chapter, we talked about food from the ocean, and we talked about the effect that fishing has on the ocean. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about some of the other effects on the ocean. And probably a lot of you might be familiar with this picture and might already know what main effect we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so some of the other main effects that humans have on the ocean, aside from fishing and taking too many fish out of the ocean, is pollution. So pollution comes in the form of nutrients, right? So we talked a bit about eutrophication, and we had the eutrophication lab. We learned a little bit about how too many nutrients can be a bad thing and can lead to anoxic or hypoxic areas that can be really harmful to marine organisms. Trash in the ocean is not so good. Sewage is obviously a bad form of pollution. Kind of relates to nutrients because there can be a lot of nutrients in sewage. And we learned when we talked about corals back in chapter 14 that there are some coral diseases that are actually linked to sewage. So we already know, I think, a pretty good amount about these things. We're going to talk mostly about the last two, about oil and about persistent toxic substances. So we're going to talk about the effect that those have on the ocean. And then we're going to wrap up this chapter at the end by talking about one of the main tools that we have for protecting the ocean from pollution and from other problems that face the oceans in the life in the oceans. Okay, so oil pollution, a lot of why it's so harmful to marine animals and plants when it gets in the ocean is that many of the components inside of oil are toxic, right? So even though oil itself, is something natural that comes out of the earth, the refining process of it, ends up putting a lot of chemicals in it that are really, really bad for marine life. Which I think, makes intuitive sense to all of us. You wouldn't want to cover yourself in oil, just as because you know that it wouldn't be a very good thing for you, just as it's going to be a bad thing for something like a sea turtle or a seabird or whatnot. So the those toxic components inside of oil, they can affect the reproduction of marine animals and plants, their growth, their development, their behavior. Their skin, of course, can get coated with it because oil is very, very sticky. And oil itself doesn't dissolve in water very well, meaning that it's hard to wash that oil off of a marine animal once it's on it. So it's a really major problem. Uh, Probably one of the best examples I have of a major effect that oil has on marine animals comes from a big spill that happened in Alaska that we'll talk about in a little bit. In that spill was inside of this kind of bay in Alaska, and essentially that spill wiped out the salmon that would run up into that bay and into that river there. So for the first couple of years after the oil spill, there was still salmon, coming back, but they were kind of malformed and they were behaving really weird. And then, after a year or two after the spill, they were just completely gone. So it had an effect on their behavior, it affected their growth, they were developing really weird, and then eventually it shut down their reproduction. So the salmon in that river just ended up disappearing as a result of a big spill in that bay where the big oil spill was. So oil obviously really bad for marine animals and plants. Okay, so some of the sources of oil in the ocean. Of course, there are some natural places where oil seeps out of the seafloor, into the ocean. But this oil isn't going to be quite as harmful because it hasn't been refined yet with and gone through a process where it becomes a lot more toxic. So there is natural oil going into the ocean, but then of course there are lots of sources of oil from us that goes into the ocean. So of course there's like river runoff. If a river, goes through an area where there are people, driving around with cars and such, when our cars, do a pretty good job of keeping oil off the street. But of course, there's some oil that spills on the street, and that oil will eventually make its way into a river and eventually run out into the ocean. So river runoff, where there's rivers, running into the ocean, there's going to be some oil going into it oftentimes. When you have refineries that are on the coast, sometimes things can go wrong with their oil refining, with their process, and so that can cause oil to go into the ocean. Of course, small recreational boats, there can be oil leaking out of their engines. When there are tankers that run into things, that can cause issues because then you have huge amounts of oil, especially tankers that are specifically carrying oil. We'll talk about an example of that in a little bit. Of course, any like large commercial boats, can accidentally spill, small amounts of oil. But because there's lots of them and they are, all over the ocean, there's lots of oil going in. And then, of course, when there are big blowouts from like offshore drilling places where they're drilling for oil on the seafloor, when there are accidents there, then huge amounts of oil can spill into the ocean. And we'll talk about a major example of that in a little bit. So there's been two major oil spills in U.S. waters, since we started, relying on oil as a fossil fuel. So kind of the first one that really got people thinking about this issue was what's become known as the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And so the Exxon Valdez was this oil tanker. And this oil tanker was leaving from Alaska and heading southbound towards refineries in California. And so a lot of you know that Alaska has a lot of oil deposits. That's why there's a lot of oil drilling up in Alaska. But there's not as much oil refining there. So essentially, oil is getting transported from Alaska to other places. And how that oil is typically transported is on these big tankers, such as the Exxon Valdez. And so the Exxon Valdez was owned by the Exxon, oil company, which is why it has that name. So this spill occurred in 1989, and it spilled some roughly 35,000 tons of oil into this small bay right there that I kind of mentioned earlier when I was talking about the salmon that were behaving strangely and that their reproduction was all messed up. Essentially, what happened is why this spill occurred is that the tanker left its dock at night, and the captain, stepped away from the helm from the boat steering wheel, and left the first mate in charge. The first mate essentially screwed up and didn't know exactly where he was, and they ran over a shallow shoal of rocks, and it ruptured the side of the oil tanker, and all the oil spilled out. So it was, of course, a huge, huge thing. That's an absolute crap load of oil, and it had major effects on the local fisheries. It had major effects on the local tourism. Of course, the Exxon company didn't want to pay out, so they fought it for like 20 years, and they only actually just finally paid the $1 billion fee that they were charged for this just very recently. So there's this legal battle that kind of dragged on for a long time. And it was a real mess, and it really showed very clearly just how evil big oil corporations are, because they did all this damage and they did everything in their power to make sure that they had to pay for that damage as little as possible. And so, luckily today there's better monitoring of these oil tankers. In fact, that's the job that a friend of mine has up in Alaska. There are these stations, and they're monitoring where all of the different ships are, and acting as sort of like a kind of watching the ships to make sure they're not getting close to any places where they could run into trouble. It's a sort of fail safe to make sure if the people on the ship don't do everything right, that somebody else is watching out to make sure that they are doing the right thing and not going to cause a big problem like this. So that was the Exxon Valdez spill. A more recent one that maybe some of you might remember was the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. Right, so whereas the Exxon Valdez was a spill related to a tanker that ran aground, this was a case where oil was being drilled for off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. So they're drilling oil out of the sea floor. And essentially what happened is there was a major screw up with the machinery, such that a bunch of oil basically came out of the seafloor faster than they could stop it. It caused this massive explosion on the oil platform, killing 11 people and spilling 672,000 tons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Right, so this spill really dwarfed the Exxon Valdez spill, which was on the Exxon Valdez spill was on the order of tens of thousands of tons, whereas this was on the order of hundreds of thousands of tons. And so this of course caused major issues. You can just see just how much of an issue it might cause. This is a picture from space. So this spill was actually able to be seen from space, right? So here is like Louisiana. You can see that this part of Louisiana that sticks out into the water. That's that right there. And so you can see just how massive this oil spill was. And so, of course, it had a big effect on tourism, on habitat, on the animals and plants in that area. BP, who was leasing out that oil platform, they were a lot more willing to pay the fines than Exxon was before them for the Exxon Valdez. And so in July of 2015, they agreed to pay $18 billion in fines. It was the largest, one of the largest settlements in a court case ever. $18 billion is a heck of a lot of money. So that was the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. There's even more recently than that. It's been found that sometimes cruise ship companies uh, can kind of be bad for this sort of thing, for oil pollution and pollutants of other toxins into the water. So Princess Cruises, who operates in a lot of different places in the world, they were hit with a fine because they were actually deliberately polluting the water. So what happens is there's big engines inside of ships such as this, and a lot of those engines produce lots of oils and toxins just from how they operate. But what these the operators of these boats are supposed to do is have all those toxins pumped out of the bottom of the boat, where it just kind of settles into the very bottom parts of the boat. And you're supposed to have that pumped out of there, not just dump it into the ocean for obvious reasons, because it's incredibly toxic stuff. But what they were doing is they were essentially just dumping it into the ocean and covering it up. So they were deliberately polluting and covering it up. And why they would do that is that it costs money to pump those pollutants out of the bottom of this boat. So they figured, well, we can just save a couple bucks. Well, they can save many bucks by not doing this the right way. But then it did cost them in the end because they were slapped with a $40 million fine for doing this. So if you are a person that goes on cruise ships, Princess Cruises might be one to avoid, since they are not known for having a good record of being environmentally conscious. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about persistent toxic substances. So these are toxic substances that because of the nature because of their chemical nature, they don't break down very easily. So they will remain in the ocean for many years rather than just breaking down. So these include certain types of pesticides like DDT. So for a long time, DDT was something that was used to control insect populations to try to kill things like mosquitoes. But it was found that DDT was a major issue for not just marine birds, but for all birds. So DDT the actual issue it caused to birds was that it would cause the shells of the bird eggs to be very thin. So the shells would break before the little baby chicks were ready to hatch. So this killed off a lot of birds, including marine birds, and including the brown pelican, which nearly went extinct as a result of DDT. Fortunately, people realized that what the issue that DDT was causing, and it was causing things birds that were endangered to go extinct. And so as a result, DDT is really not used anymore, at least in the U.S. To stop or to stop the spread of insects. Another type of persistent toxic substance I want to talk about are what are known as PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls. And so these are things that are produced in the manufacturing of electronics, of plastics, of paints. So it has to do with with byproducts of factories. And so these are things that are incredibly toxic to humans. So for instance, there's a lot of places where you might see a sign like this next to the ocean or next to a lake where it says catch and release fishing only. And it has a little picture of a fish on a plate with a line across it. And that's because, or a lot of times that's because there are polychlorinated biphenyls in that water, right? So even though these substances were banned in the late 70s, they still persist in a lot of waterways today because they don't break down, which is really problematic because they're getting into marine life, and so it's not good for them, and of course it's not good for us either. There's a lot of other heavy metals, which is why I have a picture from one of my favorite movies, Spinal Tap here. So a lot of heavy metals, things like mercury, lead, cadmium. These are things that can also get into waterways and then can cause problems, mainly because they don't break down very easily in water. So mercury, lead, cadmium, they all oftentimes come from like factories and byproducts of factories. So for instance, paints for a long time were made using lead. Of course, we know that's really bad because lead is very, very bad for you and affects cognition and can cause birth defects. Cadmium is something that used to be used in batteries a lot. We know that that's really, really toxic to us as well. Same with mercury, super, super toxic. Mercury is what used to be used inside of old analog thermometers. Now we don't use it anymore because it's really toxic. But a lot of these things still persist in waterways simply because they just don't break down. So this then kind of relates to an issue known as biological magnification. So a lot of why these persistent substances are so problematic is because they get magnified as you go higher up the food web. When you go into bigger groups or groups of bigger animals, I should say. So how this kind of works is, so imagine there's some amount of toxic mercury that is in the water. And we've learned before that as you go higher and higher up a food web, you have lower and lower amounts of biomass in each of those levels, right? So by far, phytoplankton, takes up the most biomass of living things in the ocean. And then the zooplankton that feed off of them, there's slightly less biomass of zooplankton. There's slightly less biomass of the things that eat the zooplankton, even less biomass of the things that eat the plankton eaters, and even less biomass of the things at the very top of the food web. Things like the seals and the sea lions and the sharks and the orcas and things like that. So what happens is as you go higher and higher up the food web, uh, these toxic substances get magnified because a lot of the mercury that is in the phytoplankton gets transferred to the zooplankton. And then a lot of that gets transferred into the plankton feeding fishes. And so as you go higher and higher up, you have less biomass total of the animals or plants in that group, but you have the same amount of those toxic substances, right? So if you have less biomass, but the same amount of toxic substance, you end up having a higher concentration of the toxic substances. So it's not as if there's more toxic substance in these higher groups, it's just that it's concentrated higher, right? So inside of phytoplankton, you might only find zero point 0.1 parts per million mercury, so meaning only zero point 0.1 zero point 0.1 grams of phytoplankton in if you're looking at 1 million grams of phytoplankton, only zero point 0.1 of those grams would be of mercury. But if you were to do the same with seals or sea lions, it's going to be like 100 to 250 times more. So that's why like mercury and things like that can be really problematic for things like seals and sea lions, because it can get concentrated in like lethal levels inside of those animals. This is also kind of a issue when it comes to the things that we might eat, right? So animals that are really high up on the food web in the ocean can oftentimes can really have high levels of these toxic substances in them because they're at the high parts of the food web, meaning that they have a higher concentration of those toxic things, right? So things like sharks and tuna and swordfish, you have to be careful with how much of those things you eat, because they can have high levels of mercury in them. And mercury is very, very toxic. It's bad. It's really bad for you when it causes birth defects. So that's why, typically like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they will not recommend that you eat something like tuna or swordfish or shark, very often. You should really be at most eating things like that only like once a week, because if you eat them a lot more often than that, you could get very, very high doses of mercury inside of you, which is, very, very bad for your health. I mean, in addition to the fact that, as we learned in the last chapter, a lot of those things are the like sharks and tunas and swordfish. A lot of those are the things that are hurting the most because we caught way too much of them and we're still catching way too many of them. Uh, but in addition to that, you should be wary of eating those types of fish because they can have high levels of mercury in them, because of this biological magnification issue. Okay, so let's talk about what we can do about pollutants, right? So really the main thing that we can do is lowering our reliance on oil, right? Oil is by far the most major toxic substance that is going into the oceans. And that is mainly because we use a huge amount of oil, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do to lower your reliance on oil. Um, of course, as I'm recording this lecture, we're in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak. So I'm not recommending that right now you use public transit or carpool, but when there's not a major pandemic, those are good ways to reduce your reliance on oil. Or getting to school or work by bicycle. That's what I do. I live very close to Los Angeles Valley College, so I can bike to work there. And just anything you can do to lower your reliance on that. Something that we don't think about that can actually lower our oil reliance is trying to buy as many of the products that we use as locally as we possibly can. Because if you think about it, the total like oil that's used to make a product includes, what was actually in the manufacturing of that product, but also in the transport of that product, right? So if you consume only things that are coming from like China or Malaysia or Europe or somewhere overseas, there's a huge amount of oil that's being used to get that product from overseas to America. So the more local you buy, the less of a reliance you're having on oil. Of course, this is, a little bit easier said than done because a lot of the products that we use are coming from overseas. But in the case of like food, a lot of the foods that we consume, you can get it from local sources. So the more local you can get the products that you consume, the better. The same goes with packaging, right? So all of that packaging, requires energy in order to produce. So the less packaging on the products that you buy, the better. Uh, a type of pollutant that we didn't really talk about before is the pollutants that one can find inside of sunscreens. So there is one of the main uh, chemicals inside of like a lot of the commercial sunscreens, a lot of the widely available sunscreens, is what's known as oxybenzone. And so oxybenzone has been found to be toxic not just to humans, but also to corals actually. So a good way to do a good thing for the ocean in terms of pollution, is to use ocean-friendly sunscreens. So sunscreens that don't have oxybenzone in them. And you can figure this out by looking at the back of a sunscreen container. It'll say whether it has oxybenzone or not. And typically the ones that don't have oxybenzone will say something like ocean friendly or reef safe or something like that. And of course, a lot of what we can do is supporting politicians that actually care about human health and the environment. The more of those politicians that are in charge, the better for our planet. And finally, another thing you can really do that's good for lowering pollution is supporting marine protected areas, which we're going to talk about now. Okay, so marine protected areas are any areas where certain activities are prohibited. But between these 2 points, there's a lot of different things that can occur, right? So there are some areas where there's absolutely nothing that is restricted in that area, and there are some areas where you can't even enter it. It's everything is prohibited in there. But there's a lot of leeway between those two, right? So you can restrict certain activities, in any place that has some restricted activities is technically a marine protected area. So marine protected areas, they include, a lot of different, they can include a lot of different types of prohibited activities. So for instance, a place that has a seasonal restriction on salmon fishing, that would technically be a marine protected area, because there is an activity that is prohibited. So catching salmon outside of that season would be prohibited. It could be even a little more restrictive, maybe say no fishing for salmon at any time. It could be even more restrictive, like no fishing for anything at any time in that area. Or it could be even more restrictive, where it's close to shipping, like you can't have ships in there. Maybe you can only have recreation going on. Maybe there might be only scientific research going on. There's a lot of different ways that a marine protected area can exist, and a lot of different activities that it can shut down. So marine protected areas, they come in a lot of different names, which I think oftentimes adds to the confusion of them, right? So sometimes they're called no-take zones. Those typically refer to places where you can't go fishing. There are fishery reserves, there are marine parks, there are national monuments. So a national monument is a specific marine protected area that is part of the United States National Park Service. There are marine sanctuaries, there are wildlife reserves, national parks. All of these things can be marine protected areas. Okay, so let's talk about we'll talk about a few marine protected areas. So I think we looked at this map before, but now we'll go into it in a little bit more detail. So any of the places that you see here, like these the solid red and the solid dark purple, those are places where there's no fishing allowed. So like around here, around Beg Rock, like no fishing at all is allowed there. And and off of Point Doom, like no fishing is allowed in that particular area. Then the places that are blue or pink that are on here, so those are places where there's restricted fishing. So there's like seasonal closures, or you're only allowed to fish with certain, gear. Like there's not a complete ban on fishing, but there is restrictions on fishing, right? So that includes like around, let's see, so that includes like up here, like to the west of Point Doom. There's this kind of restricted area that's not completely close to fishing, but it is restricted. Uh, the same as part of Anacapa Island, right? So within Southern California, there are different marine protected areas, but they don't all do the same thing. They don't restrict all fishing in all of the areas of them. A really big marine protected area that was put in place 4 years ago is called the Ross Sea Protected Area. So you're looking at Antarctica right here. So like this area right here is called the Ross Sea. Uh, if I remember correctly, I think this is kind of like looking north, like going this way would be going towards like Australia, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, so this whole area is known as the Ross Sea, and this is a very huge area, like twice the size. I'm sorry, like the size of Texas. And so there's kind of a general protected area zone. There's an area where you can only do research. There's an area where you can only do research on krill. So there's kind of like different levels of protection here. But what they're essentially doing is stopping fishing from happening in this area, which is a really important thing, especially for a lot of the marine mammals that live in this area, because a lot of baleen whales will come and feed in this area, and if the if like too much krill is caught in that area, or like too many of the fish that those baleen whales would eat, it's not going to be a very good place for them anymore. So this is a really important marine protected area that was put in place. It's also one that kind of gives me a little bit of hope for like sort of international diplomacy, because Antarctica does not belong to any one individual country, right? So it is kind of regulated by a whole bunch of different countries. But all those countries managed to come together and agree that we should put this area aside, to make this area protected. So that gives me a little bit of hope for the future. Okay, another marine protected area that is within U.S. waters is this one. So this is pronounced Papahanaumokuakea. Sorry, I looked up how to pronounce it, but now I forget how to pronounce it. You'll just have to type it into Google and look it up. But it's something like Papahanaumokuakea or something like that. Anyway, this was a national monument that was actually designated by Bush, by a Republican president. So he designated this in 2006, and then Obama basically expanded it in 2016. So it's kind of this interesting collaboration between a Republican president and a Democratic president that made this thing happen. And so this is a huge marine protected area. It's twice the size of Texas. So this is a large amount of area protected. So pretty much most of the northwestern part of the Hawaiian Islands is all protected, which is really a great thing. Okay, so let's talk about why marine protected areas are useful and why we should support politicians to support marine protected areas. So marine protected areas have been found to increase biomass of the fishes in those areas. And so that's what you see on here. So this is showing different sort of environmental parameters, like the biomass of the fish in that area, and the density of the fish in that area, the size of the fish in that area, the richness, meaning the number of species in that area. And what this is showing on the vertical axis is the percent change, right? So where we see 100, that means 100% change in that particular environmental variable. Zero would mean that there's no change. And by change, I mean before and after a marine protected area is put in place, right? So what is the actual change that we see? So in terms of biomass, we see a huge change. So there on average is somewhere around a 400% increase in biomass, meaning that there's 4 times as much biomass of fish in an area when you protect it than when you don't protect it. Right? So that's definitely a good thing. There's a 166% increase in density, meaning there's a 1.6 times increase in the amount of density of fish in an area when you put in protection. See the same thing with size. So the size of fish in an area goes up when you protect it, and the number of different species in an area goes up when you protect it. Right? So when MPAs are put in place, they're really shown to do some very good things on the local community and ecosystem. Right? So they have a really good effect on those things. Right? So that's really why we should be supporting marine protected areas, because they do really good things for the environment. Okay, so that's all I've got to tell you about the effects of the sort of other effects of humans on the ocean, and more on and that's all I've got to tell you about marine protected areas.